Bienvenidos a la segunda jornada de la Semana de las Políticas Públicas con base en evidencia, sexta edición. Esta mañana vamos a tener una importante conferencia sobre los impactos de los programas de educación cívica en adultos para las democracias emergentes. Para comenzar esta jornada, le doy la bienvenida a Manuel Delgado, quien nos va a acompañar como moderador. Me permito presentar una breve biografía sobre la trayectoria profesional de Manuel Delgado. Él es licenciado en Economía y cuenta con un posgrado en Estadística de la Universidad Centroamericana José Simeón Cañas UCA y una maestría en Economía de la Universidad de Sussex en Inglaterra. Ha trabajado como investigador del Instituto Centroamericano de Estudios Fiscales, como especialista en protección social en la extinta Secretaría Técnica de la Presidencia, como consultor independiente ante distintos organismos y como docente de la maestría en Estadística aplicada a la investigación. Actualmente es el coordinador del programa de estudios sobre políticas públicas y el coordinador de estudios de opinión pública en Fundaungo. Muchas gracias, Manuel, por acompañarnos esta mañana. Manuel se encargará de introducir al ponente principal de esta jornada y también en la segunda parte para acompañar las preguntas que tengan el público que nos acompaña esta mañana.
Bueno, buenos días a todas y a todos que nos acompañan. Un placer presentar a nuestro invitado de honor. Quizás también comentar, como están en la invitación, que esta conferencia será en inglés, así que estaré haciendo un poco entre español e inglés la presentación, ¿no? Bueno, quien nos presenta este día es el doctor Steven Finkel. Él es una persona experta en el análisis comparativo de la conducta política, de la opinión pública, de la democracia, de métodos cuantitativos. Tiene un doctorado, un PhD en ciencias políticas de la Universidad de Storybrooke en Nueva York y es profesor actual de la Universidad de Pittsburgh, desde el 2001. Es profesor de la Universidad de Pittsburgh del Departamento de Ciencias Políticas, ¿no? Y mucho de nuestro interés es por su análisis que él ha realizado de varios estudios, de varios proyectos de USAID sobre la eficacia o la eficiencia de los programas de educación cívica, de participación ciudadana y en varios países, ¿no? Desde República Dominicana, Sudáfrica, hasta Kenia y Tunisia, ¿no? Para nosotros es muy importante su participación. Como Fundaungo, nosotros tenemos un proyecto de promoción de la participación ciudadana y creemos que su ponencia nos será de mucha utilidad. Without further ado, I gave that presentation in Spanish, but I'm sure you know about yourself.
So, I followed along.
So we'll hear you.
Should I go?
Yes, please.
Okay, good. Well, thank you very much for inviting me, and I'm very happy to be here to talk about a topic that's been the focus of my work, as you saw in the introduction, for about 25 years now, along with policy work for USAID and other donors for about the same period of time. I was introduced at another function a couple of years ago as the godfather of USAID civic education evaluations, and I corrected them to the grandfather because I've been doing it for so long. But being involved in the field for so long has maybe given me some perspective on what the major themes of the work is, so how the field has progressed over time, and I can share some of that experience with you today. So I'll talk a little bit about how the field has evolved and summarize some of the key findings from this work, and then talk a little bit about some more recent work that I've done that maybe has some implications for how things in this area might be done in the future most profitably. So if you could, the next slide. Yeah. So, first I'm going to talk a little bit about the background and where civic education kind of fits into the democratization process, and then a little bit of some early work, some more recent experimental work. As I said, a couple of illustrations of my work that's been published recently, and maybe point the way towards the future. So next, please. Right. So, where does civic education kind of fit into the democratization process? So, political scientists for 60 some years at least have thought that there's such a thing as a democratic culture, democratic political culture, which is a kind of a syndrome or some kind of configuration of attitudes and beliefs, values, kind of intentions to participate among the masses, among ordinary citizens. And this political culture is thought and has been shown in a lot of work to prop up democratic political systems, to confer legitimacy on the system, to help maintain stability of democracies, to further democracies during periods of transition, and possibly and hopefully to kind of impede the backsliding of democracy that we're seeing now in many places around the world. So the issue is, how can we promote democratic political culture? And the field is huge in this area in terms of the political science and other literature, but a lot of them are like long-term generational processes of economic development, experience with rotating peaceful transitions of power in successful multi-party elections. So people experience democracy, and that develops these kinds of orientations. But there are also some short-term factors as well, like popular incumbents who are modeling democracy, short-term economic growth, performance of institutions can boost democratic orientations. And then civic education is another possible short-term kind of injection of stimulus to develop these kinds of political attitudes that might support democratic political systems. So I would put civic education kind of in the short-term bucket of factors that could promote democratic culture. And, it's the one that's probably the most under the control of international donors and other democracy promoters, because they can actually implement these kinds of programs. The other stuff, even in the short term, is pretty much out of the control of external forces and really more related to economics and elite behaviors and so forth. So civic education is kind of a tool that donors can use to promote democratic political culture. Next, please. So here's a definition of civic education. And education, training, awareness, these are things that the donor community is doing to promote democratic attitudes and behavior, empower individuals to defend their rights, engage in their democratic responsibilities as citizens, play an active role. So this is a really nice definition of civic education. And basically it's educational activities that promote knowledge, engagement, and support for a series of democratic values among ordinary citizens. Next, please. Right. So, there's a lot of civic education that goes on in the schools, in primary, secondary school systems, sometimes outside the school program, service learning, and so forth. And that's a really, an important part because, of course, in the socialization process, children learn that and carry it over, ideally, into their later lives. But in many places and in many activities are directed towards adults, which more sort of short term, as I said earlier, the kind of short term injection of these kinds of interventions that may and ideally would develop these kinds of orientations among adults, even among adults who had not lived maybe in democratic contexts as they were younger or weren't exposed to kind of school-based curricula that promoted democracy. So, the USAID, which I've done, the bulk of my work for, they spend, a decent amount of money every year on civic education. They're only one donor. And so globally, this is a really important part of the portfolio, usually under civil society programs in the donor kind of toolkit, because the groups who do the civic education are usually civil society groups who engage in other kinds of democracy activities as well. Next, please. Right, so, over the years, I've developed this model and sort of tweaked it at various points, but basically the idea is exposure to these kinds of civic education activities should lead to a series of changes, depending, of course, on the focus of the intervention. But over there on the right side of the screen, I have like a dashed vertical line, and that's kind of separating the impacts on the individuals who are exposed to this kind of training, and then the macro impacts on the political system or political elites. So at the micro level, we think that civic education should promote a bundle of orientations I call civic competence, knowledge about politics, political efficacy, sense that you can influence politics, awareness, developing skills that you can use to participate effectively. On the bottom, then a series of democratic values that support democracy, that are kind of intrinsic to democracy: tolerance, rejection of violence as a means for resolving political disputes, trust in other citizens and in political institutions, and overall support for democracy, which then feeds into participation in politics in terms of voter turnout and other kinds of political participation. And these kinds of micro changes are then thought to have macro implications as well for the political system. Next, please. All right, so kind of I was called 25 years ago, as I mentioned, to do some of the first evaluations of these programs about whether they work or not. And before that, there'd been maybe one or two studies anywhere so we myself and a couple of colleagues in the USAID world at that time really were I guess trailblazers of sorts. Nobody had done it before. And so we started out with country studies in Dominican Republic and Poland and South Africa, and we had a kind of a sort of a bundle of programs that were adult civic education, kind of in the same basket of things that we evaluated. That's what I call the 3-country study. And then I kind of increased the methodological rigor by we knew that there was a larger program with a lot of different NGOs getting together in consortia in Kenya in connection with the run-up to the elections of 2002. So we were able to do a pre-post study at that time where you could interview people before they were exposed to the treatments of the interventions, and then afterwards as well, to see the kinds of effects. And I did a couple of studies in Kenya. So this I call the kind of first wave of civic education impact, which is about 10, 15 years of primarily my work, and then some other individuals in the political science literature. So I'll summarize some of the findings there on the next slide. Yeah, so I won't go through all of them because we don't have a huge amount of time, but we found really pretty potent effects of these kinds of interventions, especially on participation. So you could actually get people to participate at the local level through these kinds of programs, especially the programs that brought people into contact with local officials themselves, and then people would go on to subsequent participation. So the kind of training of engaging with the political system was very beneficial. We still saw some effects on competence, some effects occasionally on democratic values and tolerance, which were a little more difficult to move, as you might imagine. We found some differential effects on trust, sometimes positive, sometimes negative. I'll talk about that a little bit more. Probably the most important stuff is in that lower left cell down there of the conditional effects. And this is really, in terms of the practical importance, that we found, more intense exposure led to much stronger effects. Workshops and programs that had a lot more civic engagement or citizen engagement, I should say, or individual engagement with the activities in the workshop, as opposed to sort of a passive lecturing program or intervention. So getting people to sort of role play and getting people to play games and to do things, in interaction with one another in the workshop itself was a very strong predictor of stronger impacts of these programs. And of course, the training of the instructors mattered. There was a huge variation in the perceived quality of the instructors, and this had a real consequence. So I think the stuff on the left side of this table is probably the most important findings. There was some other things that, like in terms of effects on people who didn't go to the workshop but who came into contact with people who did. And this is something the donor community really believes is a powerful part of civic education, kind of an amplification effect, where people who are trained and then they go on to talk about the topics in the workshop to people in their social networks, family, friends, and so on. And then these kinds of people who were in what we called the control group, who actually nevertheless had contact with people in the treatment group, reported some pretty strong changes as well. So, as I said, I think these are the kind of core findings, and they're summarized in the article that's referenced on the last slide in the Public Administration and Development in 2014, where I kind of summarized some of many of these findings. So next, please. Yeah, so this is just a summary of what I just said. It can work. Sometimes distrust as opposed to trust. I'll talk more about that. Spillover effects, participatory methodologies, intense exposures, quality instructors as really important, and some variations in the political context that we couldn't fully explain. Next, please. Now, the problem with all these studies was that they were, not the most rigorous methodologically. So here I'll criticize, that whole series of work that I did, a long time ago. We were called sometimes to evaluate these programs, well after the programs were conducted. So we had kind of retrospective designs. Kenya, we had the prospective design, but in the earlier studies, it was really like, interviewing people well after the fact. And of course, their responses may be somewhat dubious, or people who, people didn't tell us much about their experience if they didn't change a lot. So in fact, they may have said they weren't there, for example, if they hadn't experienced change. So there could be some slippage in the methodology in these early studies. We tried to kind of overcome those problems as best we could statistically, but certainly there were some limits in what we could say about the impacts with these kinds of research designs. So that was kind of the first wave of studies. The second wave, next please. Yeah, the second wave of studies kind of built on those methodological limitations and used really primarily, almost exclusively, experimental designs. And this is now the kind of, standard in the field. So, retrospective evaluations don't cut it anymore in terms of getting published, or really, and the donors are demanding more rigorous impact evaluations as well. So this, the field of civic education evaluation has grown as the evaluation, community among donors and international organizations has grown as well. So we now do primarily experiments where civic education interventions will be done in certain areas, but not in other areas, or possibly in certain neighborhoods, not others, or possibly certain households, not others, with those individuals treated in a random way, assigned to the treatment or a control group to get the intervention or not. So you have more rigorous ability to say that the groups were equal at baseline before the intervention took place. So these are much more rigorous, scientifically speaking. They're also very difficult and expensive to implement. So there are some drawbacks to these methods, but nevertheless, they're pretty much the standard now. And also in this sort of second wave, the stuff that I was focusing on in terms of political culture was broadened a little bit, I think in very fruitful ways, like not just democratic values, but the way people vote. Do people get out of their kind of ethnic, tribal, clientelistic patterns and generate voting based more on the performance of elites? That's now part of sort of civic education evaluations. Do interventions to deter election violence and vote buying, for example, do they work? Can you promote peaceful resolutions of conflicts and ethnic hostilities? These are all part of the interventions that are in kind of the toolkit now of international donors, and the political science and economic literature has included these kinds of studies in the field. There's a lot of studies that are done in different kinds of contexts. I had like 4 different countries. Now there's work all over the world in different contexts, different kinds of democratic periods in each of the countries' histories, and so on. So it's a lot more diverse, the field, than it was when we first started out in the 1990s. It's exciting. It's an exciting field. There's a lot going on. Next, please. Now, the kind of the findings are a little bit more mixed now as you get more rigorous designs and a variety of political contexts. You sometimes see positive and negative results. So it's our work back in the 90s and in Kenya was, I wouldn't say uniformly positive, but primarily positive message. Here you see many studies which continue to have these kinds of positive effects, but there's also some kind of negative impact. Sometimes no improvement. Sometimes decreasing trust and participation. Sometimes it exacerbates pre-existing inequalities in participation. So there's not a uniform set of findings here, but primarily still a positive one. So I would say mixed, but predominantly positive in terms of civic education's impact. So, the more methodologically rigorous, the more the findings have become more nuanced and not as absolutely uniform in terms of the impacts. Could one of the organizers tell me how much more time I should think about talking? Because that'll determine like where I go next. I know it's been about almost 20 minutes or so. Manuel, how long do you think?
We can go 10 more minutes.
10 more minutes. Okay.
Yes, we're very interested. So.
Okay, great. Thank you.
Take your time.
Okay, then go to the next slide instead of skipping. Then. Yeah. So I'll illustrate a couple of studies that are one of them I did a while ago, but has just been published in as you see at the bottom there in last year in the journal Democratization. And this was a write-up of a study that I did in the Democratic Republic of Congo in 2011, 2012. And this was an evaluation of the Voice campaign done through the NGO think tank IFES, if you're aware of that organization. They work worldwide. And they designed a program in conjunction with the decentralization process in the DRC at that time. And so it was a kind of an informational intervention about the decentralization process, which was going to turn into maybe more localities with more power over local revenue and so forth. But then they were also going to talk more generally about democracy, citizen responsibilities, duties, democratic processes. So there was a kind of a decentralization focus and a general democracy focus. And this was, as you see, module 2 was that sort of teaching people about how to how to engage the political process. And boîte, it was called the boîte à images in French, the box of images. And so it was really done with these 13 of these colored images would be the group meeting, where they would go through each of the images and talk about them and get people to react and to respond. It was a pretty interesting program. So, what we found, methodologically, how do you, we tried to assess whether individuals who went to these meetings changed more than people who didn't. The problem is the people who would show up voluntarily would already be kind of pro-democratic and maybe more educated and so forth. So we can't really disentangle with the old methods that we had used back in the 90s. So what we did was we took a baseline survey in certain villages, and then we randomly encouraged certain people to come to the upcoming workshop. So we gave them a little pitch about how there's a workshop happening. Would they be, if they'd like to go, it's taking place at this place, that time. And so they were randomly encouraged to go. And some people were randomly not given this script. So we have a random encouragement to, and you can skip maybe to not the next slide, even the 2 slides, which tells a little bit. Yeah, the next one after that. Yeah, so we have this encouragement to attend. So we see the kind of a circle over there on the left. It kind of feeds into attendance. If the encouragement works, the whole thing can work. But if the encouragement doesn't lead to any changes in the likelihood of attending, then the thing falls apart. And fortunately, we had about a 25% greater rate of attendance in these workshops if they were encouraged to attend. And so because it was random, it's unrelated to all this other stuff that kind of, conflates all the likelihood of showing up at these workshops and pre-existing democratic attitudes and all that kind of stuff. It's a really nice experimental design. Now, what we found was what we call the kind of demand and supply model, that civic education kind of really did increase. You can go to the next slide, please. Right, it's kind of hard to see, but in this slide, we talk about the demand for democracy, people's values for people's abilities to engage in politics, people's knowledge about the political process. All of these things increased in a positive direction. It was a really nice set of effects. And if you go to the next slide, you see there's the converse in terms of like actual satisfaction with the current political process. So support for the current decentralization, even though they learned a lot and they like decentralization in the abstract, and they learned a lot about democracy and they like democracy in the abstract, they had negative effects on their perceptions of how things were going in the DRC, which is interesting. The supply of democracy went down, the perceived supply. They were less satisfied, whereas the attitudes and the values supporting democracy went up. And so we call this a kind of a demand and supply model. And in poorly functioning systems, this is the kind of thing that you may see, which kind of explains some of the mixed findings in this literature. That as people see the kind of democratic ideal, they can compare that to what's happening in the actual on the ground in their country, and they sometimes become less satisfied. And I think it's actually a normatively appealing process because people can then put pressure on elites to become more democratic and become more accountable to democratic processes. So this is a kind of a nice, even though it's a negative effect of civic education, I think it has potentially positive long-term implications. So this was one recent study, and I'll just talk briefly about the next one on the next slide, which is, I think, where I'm going now, and maybe we'll call this the third wave, is putting civic education on social media, and because this is, of course, where people live now, on various platforms and social media. So can we do civic education with on these platforms, Facebook, Twitter, and Instagram, and so on? And if we can, I mean, you can really reach a lot more people than you could with these kind of local workshops and so on. So you have a huge potential to reach many, many more people. And of course, there's been some positive impacts of social media thought to have in the Arab Spring, for example, as kind of coordinating collective action against the autocratic regimes, and so on. On the other hand, people are, maybe less attentive to political stuff en masse in social media, and maybe they look at the things that support their own prior points of view, and so they're not open to opposing viewpoints. So there's reasons to expect positive or negative or null effects from these kinds of interventions. So what we did with support of the U.S. State Department actually funding was to use some of Democracy International civic education funds to, I think they also got funding from USAID, but this particular project, anyway, not important, but to do an experimental implementation of, so we actually designed the materials, we designed some videos, we designed videos which had different kinds of selling points, so to speak, for democracy. One video was really talking about all the gains of Tunisian democracy, what's so great about Tunisian democracy. Another one was really emphasizing how bad things were under the previous autocratic regime of Ben Ali's autocratic regime, which had been overturned in the Arab Spring. And another one was a kind of a more practical set of videos where you told people where their registration was, how to vote, what the procedures were, kind of like getting people oriented to the practicalities of the voting process. So we had 3 different kinds of videos. So what we did, we advertised on Facebook and Instagram that people could win a Netflix subscription if they would click and enter this study. So they kind of used social media for recruiting, put them onto a different site where they were randomly exposed to different democracy videos, and then we could assess the series of videos compared to a placebo group that got a bunch of videos on animal protection in Tunisia. So we could assess randomly the kind of different kinds of treatment effects from different kinds of interventions. So I guess I don't have time to talk about all of them, but this article, as you see, is coming out hopefully soon in the American Journal of Political Science, and it's really leading to a bigger cross-national project on social media and civic education. But just quickly on the results. Next slide, please. Yeah, so this talks a little bit about the experimental design. It's not important for now because we're running out of time, but if you could keep going to and this is what I just said about the different kinds of treatments. We measure different kinds of democratic citizenship attitudes. Would people register? Are people, do they like democratic regimes? And ratings of the previous Ben Ali regime, their intentions to vote, and so forth. And you can just quickly talk about, go to the next slide and I'll wrap up. Right, so we had really pretty strong effects for pooling all the treatment groups together. So the people rated the current Tunisian political system more strongly in terms of multi-party democracy. They rated the Ben Ali, the previous autocratic regime, more negatively. They had intentions to register. They had greater intention to engage in campaign activities. They had higher levels of efficacy. So again, these are pretty nice findings in terms of civic education manipulations in social media. I won't talk. You can go to the next couple, through the next keep going. I'll just mention that briefly and then keep going too, please. And then so we found we could do online civic education in a successful manner, and you get a decent amount of effects. Again, these are short-term effects. The outcomes were measured pretty close to the intervention itself. So we still don't know how long the treatments last or the effects last. But in terms of bang for the buck, so to speak, it's about 40 cents for each respondent. So it's pretty cheap to reach people. And if you get these kinds of effects with a kind of a relatively short set of interventions, it could be a pretty powerful tool. The video that stressed the problems of the previous regime, torture, loss of rights, jailing of journalists. That was the focus of that loss set of videos, and that had pretty much the stronger effects of the other two, and that we think could be useful for the current backsliding. Kind of lead people into prevent people from idealizing a previous regime that was actually fairly repressive. Okay, the last slide maybe is where we go in the future. Right. So, context effects, we're still not sure about. Where are the effects stronger or weaker, depending on where countries are in their democratic trajectory, so to speak, going upwards, going downwards. What the current state of the institutions are in the country. On the online front, we're really experimenting now. We kind of recruited people from Facebook and Instagram, then they took them to another platform where we then manipulated their exposure. But of course, a lot of people didn't go, and a lot of people are just engaged in their normal social media activities. So can we embed civic education videos, advertisements, and the like in their normal feed? And we can do that possibly to generate democratic change. And we're trying to do that in another study where we'd randomly embed civic education videos in some people's feeds and other people not, and then induce them to take a post-test on democratic values. So we kind of stay tuned on that. We don't know really how long-lasting the effects. We don't know what exactly are the right arguments to make in favor of democracy. We don't know really how to measure effects in the larger spillovers in people's social networks. And we don't really know much about the kind of teaching methodologies, and especially online, it's difficult to kind of imagine how like a participatory, well, it's not totally difficult, but it's difficult to kind of implement how kind of a participatory online intervention may take place. And so we want to try to test that stuff that we found in the very early days of civic education evaluations, see whether they can be updated, so to speak, for the digital age. So as I said, it's an exciting area, exciting, to move into the online sphere. And again, actually, we don't know whether online versus offline has greater effects. So we could say that there's maybe more intensive effects with a smaller number of people in the offline kinds of interventions versus a kind of more smaller effect, but in a much greater aggregation of individuals. So we'd have to sort of, each donor would then have to make decisions about what they wanted to maximize, the magnitude of the effects or the reach, so to speak, of the program. So these are all questions for the future, and I hope to be doing this for a while still. So thank you for listening, and I'm happy to answer any questions or comments you may have.
Thank you, professors. This has been mostly important and interesting for us because we, as I told you before, we work on this kind of project and just to know all the evaluations. I just would like to make some remarks in Spanish about the presentation, and then we'll come back to the questions. Entonces, el profesor nos comentaba de 3 olas de evaluación. Una primera ola de evaluación, teníamos este esquema que esos programas de educación cívica iban a afectar las competencias, la participación democrática y los valores democráticos, y que encontraba unos efectos moderados en las competencias cívicas, un poco más fuertes en la participación democrática y débil en los valores democráticos. Una segunda ola que se acercaba más a los experimentos, a las evaluaciones de impacto más tradicionales de un grupo de control y uno de tratamiento, tenía unos resultados bastante mixtos, positivos en algunos casos, como incrementar la accountability de las élites, la participación política, la prevención de la violencia, ¿no? Y existían también algunos efectos negativos. El engagement, o como motivaban a las personas a participar en esta educación cívica, también tenía un impacto diferenciado, Y una tercera ola que hablaba en la última participación, que tenía que ver con esta educación cívica a través de redes sociales o a través del Internet, ¿no? Que tienen un mayor alcance, pero quizás la profundidad de su impacto es menor. No pretendo volver a dar la presentación del doctor, pero solo para hacer estos remarks. So, sorry, I was just making that in Spanish, but since for El Salvador is very important, in the Democracy Index 2021, El Salvador ranked 79 in a hybrid regime, and the lower score was political culture, that was 3.75, and functioning government 3.93. So we are definitely looking at a very complicated scenario about democracy in El Salvador. We have done this kind of programs, but we have a few questions. Well, I will do one that is about the audience. I will read it textually because it's in English. But it says, civic education interventions are also measured through performance evaluation. What intermediate effects do you suggest might be sought through these types of evaluation? I understand that it's performance evaluation and not impact evaluation. What would be your opinion about it? I would add another question: is what could make more effective to change those democratic values? Since it's our main concern, where in the first wave, weak results, and that would be, and well, very interesting about the third wave. You highlighted the positive and the negative, but would you recommend it? I mean, to do this social media. I know that we have to measure whether it is the impact or the depthness of it.
Okay, so performance evaluations, recommending for social media, and the middle one was how do you change values? How do you change values?
What is the most effective way to impact them?
Okay, so the performance, I mean, this was the only thing that was done, before 1997, basically. Like the only kind of evaluations were done were like performance evaluations, or then sometimes post treatment or post intervention interviews with some participants. There wasn't really any kind of rigorous impact evaluation. But now we have both. So there's performance and there's impact. And the performance measures, in my view, is useful to say if the program is doing what it's supposed to be doing. So if you don't find effects at the impact stage, is it because the content of the program is poor or is ineffective, or is it because it was implemented ineffectively, or and it didn't reach the people it was supposed to reach, or it didn't train people in the manner that the program was supposed to train people? So many programs have kind of like a goal for participatory methods or for interactive instruction, but on the ground, sometimes you don't get the right kinds of trainers, and you don't train the trainers properly. And so, so I look at performance evaluations as kind of like a successful performance evaluation is kind of a necessary condition for seeing impact. And so, you can work backwards when you don't see impact. It could be that it's a bad program in terms of the design, or it's a bad program in terms of implementation. And so the performance, in my view, kind of gives you some insight into that.
Yeah.
On the values side, this is tough because, values are deeper attitudes and perspectives, beliefs of the individual. They're kind of core to individuals' identities in many cases. So it makes sense that it would be more difficult to change. But I have found, and this was in the retrospective studies and in the Kenya kind of prospective study, that these kinds of participatory methods were really effective in changing values in addition to participation and other kinds of participatory orientations like political efficacy. So what I did was, you have people answering like how many how many of the following things were done in your workshop? Did you play role play? Did you do games? Did you talk to each other in the work? Did you solve problems together as a group? These kinds of things. And I aggregated the perception of people who were in a given workshop. So you had a lot of variety of people's perceptions of how many of these activities were done in a given workshop. And it turned out not just individuals' own opinions, but the kind of objective sense from the group had a very strong effect on the development of political tolerance, for example, a kind of a core democratic value. So I would say difficult to change, but under some conditions, mainly in how the workshops or the interventions are done, you get the most. On the social media side, and this kind of feeds into why you wouldn't expect social media to have huge effects, because it's really passive. You're just reading stuff, or you're kind of like watching a video, or you're not really doing anything. So in a sense, in that sense, social media is not super promising, because it's kind of like absorbed passively. So we have to figure out ways of engaging people, either through, really interesting videos, interactive. We tried asking people a quiz after they see something, kind of like doing something, writing a little essay or a couple sentences about what they saw in the video. These are possibilities for kind of doing a little bit more engagement. Whether you should do it or not, I think you should, because there's so much anti-democratic material out there on social media. I think that it would be a good idea to get some pro-democratic, especially these days, with all of the anti-democratic forces worldwide spewing misinformation and so forth in social media venues. These kinds of things can maybe begin to be, kind of a counter to some of these stimuli.
Okay, well, thank you. I would like to dip on all your comments, but I will make another question from the audience.
Sure.
And this is in Spanish, so I'll translate. But they say, what role should university education should play on civic education in Latin America? And the question comes because they see the emphasis, or they see they being primarily focused on basic education, secondary education, and is non-existent on universities. So what opinion do you have, or what role should university have on civic education?
Yeah, without, I guess I don't know the kind of educational structure well enough in El Salvador to really comment authoritatively. My inkling would be there's a role to play for universities, but depending on how many people in the country go to universities and the selection mechanisms of people in the universities, they're already kind of on their way to democratic orientations. They're already highly, they're kind of, by virtue of going to the university, they're probably in the upper echelon of people who would be sort of leaning democratic in the first place. So to some extent, I would recommend more on the high school level, because that's universal in a country. So even if you don't go on to the university, you have some exposure to civics and civics training. So that would be one thing. However, there have been some really success stories around the world for university programs. They call them democracy camps. I don't know if your audience is familiar. There's one in Kyrgyzstan, for example, and elsewhere, where university students are taken in a couple of weeks of training, intensive training in democratic practices and knowledge. And then there've been some longer term evaluations that these people then go on to positions of authority, and they're already can push the system in a somewhat more democratic manner. So I would say, there's both sides of the issue. There can be real focused training of future leaders through university education, but you don't want to limit it to those, because you want to make sure that the population at large, probably the vast majority, will not go on to university education, can have some exposure as well. I
think we could go all the day with the discussion. That is very interesting for us. If there is no further questions, I would thank you for your exposition, and
it was a pleasure.
hope to keep in touch in this matter.
Absolutely. If I can be of assistance to anyone's work in this field, I'm happy to. You know where to reach me at the University of Pittsburgh.
Thank you very much.
Okay. Thank you.
Muchísimas gracias, Manuel Delgado, y muchísimas gracias al señor Steven Finkel por su importante presentación esta mañana. Sin más, los invitamos a acompañarnos mañana a partir de las 8:30 en la conferencia Tendencias Mundiales del Empleo Juvenil 2022, Invertir en las transformaciones de futuros para los jóvenes. Agradecemos nuevamente a todas las personas que nos han acompañado tanto en la jornada inaugural del día de ayer como en la segunda jornada de esta mañana, y esperamos que sigan acompañándonos en el resto de conferencias que vamos a tener a cabo durante toda la semana. Muchísimas gracias, que tengan buen día.